Moses.
My name is Amir.
And we're first going to tell you a little bit about how the brain works. So can somebody tell me what they think the brain is? Anyone?
It's an organ.
Yeah, it's an organ. And what we like to think about the brain is that it's sort of like a control center of your body. Because you have a brain, you're able to think, you're able to have personality, you're also able to move around and like be able to breathe. And also because you have a brain, you're able to learn in a class like this. And here are some fun facts about the brain. First, the brain contains 1 trillion cells, and 1 trillion is really big, it's a million times a million. And then 1 neuron, which is the one cell, like a specialized cell in the brain, can have up to 1,500 connections. And if you touch the brain, which you can do after these presentations, it kind of has the consistency of hard jello. And the brain uses electric signal to communicate, and when you're awake, your brain actually produces enough electricity to power a small light bulb. And here's a structure of a neuron, and a neuron is a specialized cell of the brain. It's a fundamental unit of the brain. And this is kind of like a schematic representation of a neuron. And right here you have the roundish part that's called the cell body. And right here you have these branches. These are called the dendrites, and this is where the neuron receives information. And you have like this long branch, this is called an axon, and at the end of the axon is the axon terminal, and this is where the brain passes on information onto the next neuron. And here is a connection between 2 neurons, so this is neuron number 1 and this is neuron number 2. So you can see here the neuron uses electric signals, and once the electric signal passes down all the way to over here, which is the axon terminal, like we talked about before, it contains these little pockets of chemicals called neurotransmitters. And what happens is that the first neuron over here releases these pockets of chemicals onto this gap between the first neuron and the second neuron. And this is called a synapse or a synaptic cleft. And then over here, this is the second neuron. It has these like little things right here called the receptors. And the pockets of chemicals, neurotransmitters, can bind to these receptors, and then it will elicit some sort of action. And this is how the brain passes along information from neuron to neuron. And we can think about how the neurotransmitters bind to receptors, kind of like a key and lock model. And over here you have the keys. These keys can either be a neurotransmitter, but can also be like a drug that you take. And the receptors is like what we talked about before. It's usually the second neuron that receives the information about the neurotransmitters. So how this works is that only the key that has a similar shape to the lock can bind to the receptor. So can anybody tell me between A and B which one was more likely to bind to the receptor?
A.
Yeah, that's right. So A would bind to the receptor, and then this would cause some sort of action. And 2 important neurotransmitters we like to talk about are serotonin and dopamine, and these are 2 of the most important neurotransmitters involved in addiction. And these are involved in something that we like to call reward. And the rewarding experience is just something that you think is really positive or feels really good. For example, if you eat a really delicious chocolate cake, or if you get an A on the test and you feel really good, and we call these rewarding experiences. And these neurotransmitters are also involved in modulating mood and also pleasure and pain, but as well as learning and memory. And now Amir will tell you more about drug abuse and addiction.
All right, so now we get to the fun stuff, drug abuse and addiction. So as you can see, there are a whole bunch of different types of drug categories. Now we're not going to go over all of them here today, but you can see that there are a ton of different drugs out there. So I want to ask you, why do people take drugs? Why do you think people take drugs? Yes?
Bored with their life.
Bored with their life, okay. Yes? Sorry, what was that? Depression? That's a good one, yes.
For fun.
For fun?
Medical purpose.
Medical purpose. All right, these are all great reasons. So we mentioned a few of them, right? It feels good to fit in, to escape reality, depression, all these things are reasons why people would want to take drugs. But also keep in mind, people sometimes take drugs because of peer pressure, as well as some form of enhancement. For example, taking steroids. A lot of people don't realize that steroids are also drugs, and taking them can have some serious effects, which takes us to our next point. So we talked about this briefly, what the reward pathway is. So this involves a couple areas of your brain that are responsible for making you feel good when you do certain things. Like we mentioned, eating a nice chocolate cake, getting an A on a test. So as you can see, it involves the neurotransmitter dopamine. So we have these, what we call dopaminergic pathways, where dopamine is released into these areas of the brain to cause that feeling of pleasure and cause that feeling of reward. Now, what happens when you take drugs is it'll actually change up this circuitry, the brain circuitry. So drugs will change up the connections you have between different neurons, and that'll ultimately, basically what we like to call hijack your brain. So you no longer really have control over what feels good anymore. And it's almost like the drugs have an opposite effect when you're not taking them anymore. So when you start off taking drugs, it's because they feel good, they make you feel good. But after a while, they change up that circuitry in a way that when you're not taking those drugs, you feel horrible. So that forces you to keep wanting to take those drugs just so that you get rid of that horrible feeling. And that's ultimately what leads to addiction. So you're no longer in control, but in reality what happens is the drug begins to control you. So as you can see, it starts with pleasure, but then leads to pain. And it's up to you to really try to break out of this cycle in order to overcome your addiction.